right, let's get started. What initially got you interested in Elaine May and her work?
So for me, I think the Heartbreak Kid was the first one I had seen that she directed, and I think I got to it mainly because I was a Charles Grodin fan, and I was just looking for the big Charles Grodin movies, and there was this one that was hard to find, and I wasn't really sure why. I tracked it down, and in trying to figure out why I couldn't find it, I landed on this story of Elaine May, who was Mike Nichols' improv partner, and I didn't know a ton about her, and it sort of led me down the rabbit hole of all of the Mike Nichols movies and Elaine May's movies, who I think they're generally, as you can see, this is a good example, a little messier, a little meaner, and idiosyncratic in a way that I like more, ultimately.
I think the first Elaine May movie I saw was A New Leaf, which I watched on a library DVD and thought it was hilarious, like the funniest thing I'd seen in years. And then I've been a Mike Nichols fan for as long as I've been watching movies, but I wasn't really aware of Elaine May either. And then I found the rest of her filmography, which is not very long. It's only 4 movies. But I had the most trouble finding The Heartbreak Kid. But yeah, there's something about her comedy that feels so modern, and she and Mike Nichols really were pioneers of modern comedy. And yeah, I just think she's neat.
So you touched on her comedy a little bit. How did she get her start in Hollywood?
So she became really famous as Mike Nichols' comedy partner. They had a very famous improv duo called Nichols and May, and they really shaped improv comedy as we know it today. And then from there, she made some movies. She's acted in some movies. She's written a lot of screenplays, been a script doctor on a lot of very famous movies. Am I missing anything?
No, and it's, so Mike Nichols, in case anyone doesn't know, he made Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf and The Graduate were his 2 first movies. And they're kind of interesting parallel with Elaine May. Her first 2 movies were A New Leaf and then The Heartbreak Kid. And The Heartbreak Kid and The Graduate, certainly I was thinking as I was watching the ending, there's just so much overlap in terms of like these 2 lost guys who've been chasing something, but they're not sure what they're chasing. They're not sure if they've gotten it. And Elaine May and Mike Nichols were certainly people who were both kind of difficult to work with. And they both were control freaks, and it's so funny to me that they were really drawn to improv, where you can't really control where it's going. And that led to a lot of interesting comedy, but also kind of the disillusion of their bond. And they had periods where they liked each other, periods where they didn't talk to each other. But Elaine May's movies, I think it's interesting, and this is a good example as well, of they're all kind of about partnerships that are fraying and people who don't quite work together, or they want to work together and something isn't working about that, which doesn't sound very funny, but as you can see, it can be, or in the case of Ishtar, it certainly can be funny if these 2 guys think they're Simon and Garfunkel but don't know how to write music and can't sing. So this kind of distance between what people think they want to be and what they are keeps coming up. And she would go to that as much as she could, but as Courtney said, her career was fairly short as a filmmaker because she didn't get that many chances to keep going after a couple of flops.
So Elaine May was a woman in the film industry at a time when there were not very many women at all. In your podcast, I think you mentioned a statistic about women in
I have it in my pocket.
Have it
I don't know if you have it memorized.
Yeah, I think I do actually.
Okay.
So between 1949 and 1979, there were about 7,300 odd movies came out of the studio system. And women directed 14 of them. So Elaine May was responsible for 3, so she was responsible for like 20% of women's film output during this 30-year period. Ida Lupino made 7, so she was responsible for half. And then there were films like Wanda, some Claudia Weil, she had 1 or 2, I think, but she was responsible for 20% of the films directed by women.
I think what's crazy about that is 20%, and we're talking about 3 movies.
Yeah, right. Right.
But yeah, I think what's interesting about Elaine May is I don't think she really wanted to be the model woman filmmaker. And specifically with A New Leaf, she was kind of put in the position of, this was right as New Hollywood was starting and different voices were getting opportunities to make movies who hadn't really gotten those voices before. And so there was this question of, can a woman direct a movie? Can a woman be responsible for this big production? And she became a test for that. without really having experience, without a producer who was there to help guide her in a way that a lot of the men at the time did have. And so her productions were historically very messy. She was an experimenter, an improviser. And so she was then seen as sort of like, well, look what happens when women direct movies, which is not what she ever wanted. And yet she still sort of was stuck in that place. And then it sort of, some people would say, led to her reputation of being someone who was, historically not only messy, but, Ishtar is known as the worst movie of all time.
Rewatch it. It's not.
It's not. And that was kind of the hook for me with the whole project, which was everybody we talked to was quick to say, Elaine May is a genius, and yet she's known, unless you sort of are old enough to know Nichols and May really well, most people know her as the director of the worst movie of all time. So how does a genius make the worst movie of all time? Well, she doesn't, right? But why was that the politics that sort of led to her being this punching bag? And a lot of that is gendered, as you hear if you listen to the episodes.
And her film career, it started with A New Leaf, but she wrote that screenplay, she adapted it, and she never intended to direct it. The deal was the studio, she went to the studio and said, can I choose the director for the screenplay? And they said, no, but you can direct it. And in doing that, they were, one, saving money, because as a woman and as a first-time director, they didn't have to pay her as much as they would have a more experienced male director. And also, it could make them look good by having a woman on their payroll, basically.
Yeah, and then she also starred in that.
Yeah.
So as far as I know, I think she did 3 jobs for the price of 1.
Yep.
So the script was written by Neil Simon, who was coming off of 2 back-to-back hits of his own. What was his relationship like with Elaine May?
So Neil Simon did sort of like audience-friendly stories. They were comedies, they were broad, they were popular, they were palatable.
Did Out-of-Towners, The Odd Couple, things like that.
Yeah, and then Elaine May had this great line about her approach to storytelling, which is she wanted audiences to laugh and laugh and laugh and laugh and then go home and shudder. Little different. And so I think Neil Simon, so Neil Simon has this script that's sort of like part of the Neil Simon brand, and then Elaine May was going to Elaine May it because that's what she did, and so he contractually made it so she had to shoot his script, and so she actually had the least control creatively over what each scene would look like, over what each line would look like. She could not experiment endlessly as she would do in all of her other movies. So her contributions then are all sort of the tone and the casting and bringing that shudder, which I think is all over the movie. Cringe comedy is all over this movie.
Sorry, do you want to add something?
Oh, I guess her relationship with Neil Simon, there, as you kind of alluded to, there were a lot of creative differences. And did you mention they shot each scene twice?
Yes, yeah. So there's the Simon version and then not.
Right. And then he also, the screenplay originally had a different ending as well. And the final cut did not use his ending. It was the same thematically, but I think it's like he and Kelly are on their honeymoon and he realizes that he's made the mistake a second time. And I don't think he ever forgave the production for not including his original ending in the final cut.
Yeah, it's fitting. It's one of many partnerships that were tense between Elaine May and somebody else.
Yeah.
So the casting is kind of curious. There's Jeannie Berlin, who is Elaine May's daughter, who plays Lila. Sybil Shepherd and Charles Grodin were all relatively unknown names at the time. What can you tell us about how they came to be in the Heartbreak Kid?
So I think Elaine May had Charles Grodin in mind from the beginning. They had met at a party, and he had been in some smaller projects up to that point, and she just thought he would be perfect for this role. I think the same was with Jeannie, her daughter. She fought pretty hard to keep Jeannie in the movie. That was another thing. Neil Simon did not want Jeannie Berlin in the movie. He wanted Diane Keaton, I think, in that role.
Yeah, but then the idea was there wouldn't be enough contrast culturally, I think, between the two.
Right, yeah. And then Sybil Shepherd replaced a different actress who I don't think is mentioned by name even in Carrie Corrigan's book. But the story with her is she was a brunette, but the character had to be blonde, and they bleached her hair, and then her hair fell out. So they had to recast her as Sybil Shepherd, who had only been in one movie up to this point. She had been in The Last Picture Show a couple years before this, so she was also a brand new actress.
Yeah, I think Grodin, we know him as this comedy sort of persona now, but at that point he was a villain in some Western TV projects, and then he has the turn in Rosemary's Baby. And so this villainous turn, I think, is actually really genius in terms of what the casting does, because there's a way to tell this story that is sort of like, you like this guy more, that he does a lot of weird, ridiculous things, but ultimately, poor him, he did marry this annoying woman, and that's so bad. And that's Ethan Warren in our episode on this says that's kind of the misogynistic way to tell this story, which you can see. It's called The Heartbreak Kid. It's a remake by the Farrelly brothers starring Ben Stiller. It's out there.
Don't watch that one.
But what Grodin does is, it's very funny to watch him get annoyed, but also I don't think there's necessarily always a righteousness to his anger, and what he's annoyed at can both be wrong and bad, and there even can be that villainous element that he had done in his career up to that point that comes through in a way that's funny, but it's not asking for you to be all that sympathetic to him. And it also makes that more cruel toward Jeannie Berlin, which I think, casting her daughter, I'm sure the compassion that she has and the calibration of how cruel she can be to her daughter was something that Elaine May was aware of and probably made different choices as a result of, as opposed to if she had just cast somebody else that she met in a casting session.
I think so. I think Elaine and Jeannie both wanted Lila to be very sympathetic. Lenny is not sympathetic at all. We hate Lenny, right? But Lila, she gets her heart broken. She's in love with this guy, and then he dumps her. And I know that Jeannie is quoted as saying, "I didn't want this girl to be stupid." And she's naive, but she's not stupid. She knows something's up. So there is a misogynistic reading of this film. I don't see it that way.
Well, I think everybody who Elaine May portrays is portrayed in not a totally positive way.
Right.
She's, mean is a word that comes up a lot in both the people who like her comedy because it's funny and it's mean, but also some people found her to be sort of uncharitable to different types of people. Like there was some feminist critiques of the movie that the way she handles the portrayal of women was not good because it was too critical or too sort of harsh at times. But she was just a harsh filmmaker. She's a harsh storyteller. Her sense of humor is very harsh, and so I think the compassion is there, and she can be kind of harsh toward Jeannie's character as well.
Yeah, there's a story about when she met Mike Nichols for the first time at the University of Chicago. The mutual friend introduced them and said, "Mike, meet Elaine. She's the only one on campus who's as hostile as you are." And that was part of her reputation as being difficult. She had a singular vision, and she got the definition of, or she got the, prickly is kind of the maybe less dog whistly word for it, but yeah.
So The Heartbreak Kid has long been considered a lost film. How did you first watch The Heartbreak Kid?
I think we both watched it on YouTube, right?
So I thought I watched it on YouTube. Apparently this is disputed because I said that on the radio, and then an internet acquaintance messaged me and said, "No, years ago I sent you a Google Drive link and you watched it on that." And this person has since put unnamed NPR source in his Twitter bio, so I don't know. Maybe that's true. I don't want to perjure myself beyond what I already have.
We both watched it, under dubious legal conditions. Because it's hard to find. It's not streaming anywhere. The very few DVDs that are out there are not very good quality, and they're like $100 online. This is a hard movie to find.
So tell us about its slide into non-existence and who owns the rights now.
Yeah, so it was distributed by a smaller distributor in the 70s. I think it's called Palomar. And it was just a sort of normal release at the time. But then, as happened over the course of several decades afterward, if a company was not doing well, it was sort of acquired or absorbed into other entities. And so several iterations of that happened until it became owned by Bristol Myers Squibb, which is a pharmaceutical company with no interest in distributing movies then or now. And so they own a handful of movies, probably a few others you might have heard of or seen, but they don't feel any incentive to do anything with them. And so they have to sign off every time there's a screening, which I guess is actually fairly common with The Heartbreak Kid these days. But any of those things, basically, you either happen your way into finding it at a library, VHS, DVD, maybe Turner Classic Movies, maybe an unnamed NPR source, send you a Google Drive link. But yeah, it's sort of in limbo. And the question that came up for us, we even talked with Elizabeth Purcell about this, was why would they not just sell it off and make some money and let people appreciate it? And I don't know the answer to that.
Her answer was it's small change. I think Bristol Myers Squibb is like the second biggest pharmaceutical company in the world. So like film rights for a 52-year-old movie, I think it's just not on their radar at all. It literally is small change.
But it's annoying to have to
It's
answer
very
the
annoying.
emails.
It's very annoying. Yeah, yeah. I'm really hoping that Elizabeth Purcell's rescuing of the 16 millimeter film reel will open the door for a Criterion Collection release or something.
Well, yeah, and I think part of the reason why we're able to see it or why it's found and why there are screenings is because there's this sort of resurgence of interest in Elaine May that there wasn't for a long time. She hasn't made a movie since the 80s, despite she wants to make another one. She can't find funding for it. And so as a result of stuff like this, places like film streams, I think there's an awareness of Elaine May and this movie, and that interest hopefully can move the dial.
Absolutely. I think that's all we have time for right now at the moment. So if we want to chat, is it okay if we meet with you out in the lobby?
Sure.
Great. Thank you so much for coming today, and we hope to see you in the upcoming weekends here at Film Streams.
Thanks, everybody.